Most casual Cold War history buffs and scholars of the war in Vietnam will be familiar with the fact that the war was fought primarily between the North Vietnamese army with the help of their ally guerrilla army, known as the Viet Cong, against the South Vietnamese supported by their American and other allies. But what many people may be unaware of is the fact that in the Central Highlands and some of the lowlands near the Cambodian border, there was actually a third faction with very complicated and sometimes changing allegiances. I am, of course, talking about the United Front for the Liberation of Oppressed Races, better known by its acronym FULRO. This faction, at various times, fought both with and against the South Vietnamese Army and the Khmer Rouge. They almost always viewed the communists as their ideological enemy, but at times worked with them in Cambodia to fight against what they viewed as the bigger threat, that being the Vietnamese communists. To fully show how complicated their alliance situation is, I feel the easiest way is by showing you this belligerent section on their Wikipedia page. By this point, you are probably asking, what is this FULRO group and why did they go to war as a third faction? Well, FULRO was a guerrilla movement that formed in response to mistreatment of the Montagnard people by the majority ethnic Vietnamese living in Vietnam on their ancestral territory. Now, you may be wondering, what is a Montagnard? Well, to put it in a way that my American audience can digest it easiest, I would say they are kind of comparable to Native Americans. They are a loosely grouped together collection of tribal ethnic minorities that occupy the hills and mountains of Vietnam in the region known as the Central Highlands, though some also lived in the lowlands near the Cambodian border. The term Montagnard is a name given to this group by the French, and it encompasses about 30 distinct tribes, of which each has its own distinct language, culture, and religious beliefs, which often differed greatly from the beliefs of the Vietnamese. Some of these tribal groups knew Vietnamese as a second language, although some didn't speak Vietnamese at all. This was due to their isolated nature prior to ethnic Vietnamese colonization of their land. Some of these tribes lived very primitive lives compared to the rest of Vietnam. A few Christian missionaries which contacted some of the tribes noted some of them as living as our ancestors did during the Stone Age. One Montagnard I spoke with told me that in the early 1950s, a car visited his village for the first time, and the people of his village didn't know what to make of it. Some believed it to be a god, and the elders made arrangements to give it an offering of fruit, vegetables, and sacrifice a water buffalo to appease it. Though I could rattle off all the tribal names that the term Montagnard encompasses, I'm going to try and keep it limited to some of the most notable ones that had some of the highest numbers of participants in the FULRO movement, but know that these are far from the only tribes which participated. The founding tribe, credited with making up the backbone and the predecessor of FULRO, are the Banar, Jare, Rade, and Kaho tribes. Since 1956, the U.S. anti-communist strategy was for the American military advisors to go into villages to equip the Montagnard youth with weapons to form a Montagnard civilian indigenous defense group. They also recruited some of them for special forces. This played a vital role in the future members of FULRO viewing the U.S. as the only group of outsiders they could trust, because unlike other groups who wanted to tax, conscript, or expel the Montagnards from Vietnam, they saw the Americans as simply arming them with both knowledge and weapons for their own self-defense, and not asking anything more of them than to protect the land that they already had from communist aggression. This to them was a very agreeable sentiment. In 1958, under the leadership of a 45-year-old Rade tribesman named Y Bam Inyol, the first Montagnard political and military resistance group was formed, called Bajaraka. This name, Bajaraka, is an acronym created to pay homage to the first few letters of the founding tribes of the movement. The spark for this movement forming was from the new president of South Vietnam resettling Catholic refugees from North Vietnam escaping the communist land reforms into Montagnard ancestral land with no regard for the autonomy of the Montagnard tribesmen. To learn more about the disastrous communist land reform of North Vietnam, which resulted in the mass exodus from the north to the south, please check out my video I made about that subject, which will be linked in the description and comment section below this video. In May 1958, Ibam Inyol and 16 other ethnic representatives signed 2 letters of protest sent to the French, U.S., and other embassies in Saigon, as well as the United Nations, denouncing the discriminatory acts against ethnic tribes in the highlands. The letter also highlighted their growing annoyance with the aggression of the newly formed Viet Cong against their people. Bajaraka asked the great powers to intervene so that the Montagnards could have an isolated territory in the highlands with clearly defined borders. They wanted to be left out of the growing conflict between the communist North and anti-communist South Vietnamese. But their requests fell on deaf ears. The South Vietnamese viewed them at times as a nuisance and at other times as a potential source for exploitable tax revenue. The North Vietnamese viewed them as a potential pool of bodies to draw from for forced conscription into their communist army. Bajaraka's response was just that they wanted to be left to live their lives in peace and to create a micronation in the highlands segregated from the Vietnamese majority that outnumbered and surrounded them. In September 1958, after Bajaraka organized a series of demonstrations in Kon Tum, Pleiku, and Bun Mae Tuot, Iba Mignol was arrested along with the other leaders of the Bajaraka movement. In November of 1963, after the coup that overthrew and killed Ngo Dinh Diem, Iba Mignol was released. In 1964, Iba Mignol participated in the founding of the FULRO organization. An important distinction that differentiates FULRO from Bajaraka is that FULRO absorbed other separatist groups in different areas of South Vietnam into their movement. The two most important groups of note that joined them were the Khmer Krom and the Cham ethnic minority in Vietnam. The first people talk about are the Cham. This ethnic minority has been in the lands of modern-day South Vietnam since long before the ethnic Vietnamese took over and turned them into an ethnic minority. In fact, the Cham people ran a large empire in Southeast Asia that lasted from about 192 AD until 1832. Of note, they historically had their own religious traditions, heavily influenced by Indian religious traditions, but in the 5th century, Muslim traders converted a large portion of the Cham into Muslims. And over time, this became the predominant religion of the Cham people, with Hinduism still hanging on in the hearts of some as a minority religion. The reason for their shrinkage and decline as an empire can be attributed to hundreds of years of warfare between themselves and their neighbors. The Dai Viet, also known as the Vietnamese, conquered the last remnants of the kingdom of the Champa and sent their king into exile in Cambodia in 1832. The Cham Muslims, in a last-ditch effort, launched a short-lived and also the only jihad ever recorded in Vietnam against the conquering Nguyen dynasty. But it was brutally put down in 1834, and in response to this religious unrest, the Vietnamese took harsh measures against the conquered Cham. These measures ensured they would not revolt again for a very long time. Their population decreased significantly over time. Though I couldn't find exact population numbers for the Cham at the time of the fall of their empire, sources I checked noted it declined rapidly, due in part to genocide and large groups of Cham moving to Cambodia and Thailand to escape their occupiers. By 1885, only about 40,000 Chams remained in the old territory, and over time they would continue to be pushed off of their most popular lands and increasingly were pressured to move to other areas for Vietnamese colonists to occupy their old lands. Many found themselves moving west, close to the border of Cambodia. By the time of the war in Vietnam, most were relocated to the western provinces, such as An Giang, though some remained in areas on the coast, such as Phan Rang and Binh Dinh. In 1962, a Cham man named Les Cosim, with experience working as a paratrooper under the French, flamed the sentiments of Cham nationalism and formed a group of his own with similar goals to Bajaraka. His group was called Front de Libération du Champa, FLC for short. They demanded autonomy for the Cham people and were moving towards restoring an independent Champa nation. By 1964, they united their group with FULRO. Despite their distance from the central highlands of Vietnam, they recognized early on that their goals were pretty much the same, and figured they would be stronger together as one force operating with the goal of independence for their tribal and racial groups to separate and be left alone by the Vietnamese. The other important group to talk about is the Khmer Krom. The Khmer Krom are an ethnic minority group located in the southwest of Vietnam. Their history is directly tied to the fact that they are the descendants of the people who were left in southwest Vietnam when the Dai Viet conquered the land over the course of many historical wars, as well as diplomatic annexation of the Cambodian Khmer Empire. The Khmer Krom people are essentially the Cambodians who stayed in Vietnam after their land was taken over by the Vietnamese people. An interesting cultural note that differentiates them from the Vietnamese are their religious traditions. Although they are Buddhist, the school of Buddhism they follow is Theravada Buddhism, as opposed to the Mahayana sect of Buddhism practiced by the majority of Vietnamese Buddhists. Some of the Vietnamese viewed them as being more loyal to Cambodia than Vietnam, and this resulted in many instances of discrimination against them. In 1960, the Front for Liberation of Khmer Krom, aka FLKK, was formed with much the same goal as the other groups we have discussed in wanting independence for their people. By 1964, when they were invited to join FULRO, the members of FLKK joined enthusiastically. Their addition to FULRO came with an added benefit of drawing the support of the King of Cambodia, Norodom Sihanouk, which would play a vital role in helping FULRO get armed with weapons smuggled in from Cambodia. Although the Vietnamese were not happy with it, the United States supported FULRO. Their idea of uniting the ethnic tribes together as a way for them to better resist the communists invading the South from the north seemed like a good idea for them. Ibam Manuel, for the time, was the face and de facto leader of the FULRO movement. In 1964, the guerrilla activity started to grow, and they began to get violent against not only the North Vietnamese, but also the South Vietnamese, who they viewed equally as oppressors. Montagnards, who had nothing to do with FULRO, were increasingly being abused by the Vietnamese, who misunderstood who was and wasn't supporting FULRO. Their actions of beating and killing Montagnards out of suspicion of them being with FULRO did not scare them into submission, but rather it only served to radicalize groups of them that wouldn't have otherwise been interested in joining. Violence boiled up on September 19, 1964, when commandos of the Special Forces and the Montagnard civilian combat teams rose up and captured several posts in Quang Duc and Dak Lak. They killed 35 Vietnamese soldiers and captured the district chief of Duc Lap. They also occupied the Bun Mae Tuot radio station and sent out a broadcast calling for the establishment of an independent nation for their groups comprising FULRO. The next day, Brigadier General Nguyen Phuc Vinh Loc, the commander of the 2nd Corps Tactical Zone, reacted strongly. He ordered the 23rd Infantry Division, along with several Ranger and Armored battalions, to surround the radio station and the occupied outposts. When the rebels were about to be destroyed, Brigadier General Vinh Loc suddenly received a recommendation from the U.S. Embassy in the Highlands to negotiate rather than wipe them out. Negotiations between the rebels and the commander, along with the U.S. Embassy representative, reached an agreement for those rebels to be released on the condition that they leave the area. The rebels obliged and left, many of them retreating over the border into Cambodia. Sometime in 1964, the FULRO flag was designed. It consists of 3 stripes: blue, symbolizing the ocean; red, symbolizing struggle; and green, the color of the mountains and forests. Above the red stripe are 3 white stars. These symbolize the 3 main components of FULRO: the mountain tribes, the Cham, and the Khmer Krom. I have also been told some people further espouse that the 3 stars also represent the 3 dominant religions that coexist in the group, that being Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam. Near the end of 1964, FULRO became politically divided into 2 camps. The moderate group, led by Ibam Manuel, advocated lobbying the United States to pressure the government of the Republic of Vietnam so that FULRO could return to Vietnam to operate officially and independently manage anti-communist goals while also coordinating with the South Vietnamese. And the other camp being the extremist military group led by Y Don Adrong, which advocated using violence to establish an independent nation. Due to the decentralized nature of the FULRO movement, a consensus for which way to use the movement would take a long time to get all the members on board with. On October 15, 1964, a Congress of the Montagnard ethnic groups was convened in Pleiku to prepare for a better policy. It wasn't until August 2, 1965 that a joint declaration on the Vietnamese and Montagnard cooperation in the effort to find a peaceful and anti-communist solution was signed. The reconciliation negotiations between the Republic of Vietnam government and the FULRO faction were going smoothly when, from December 12th to December 18th of 1965, the extremist FULRO faction group attacked an outpost in Phu Tien, killing 32 people and injuring 26. They then raised the FULRO flag over the administration buildings there. Upon receiving news of the rebellion in Vietnam, Ibam Manuel ordered the arrest of the extremists at the border. He had them brought to Camp Le Rollin for execution. When the incident happened, Les Gossem did not dare to oppose Ibam Manuel's leadership of FULRO Montagnards, but instead placed trusted Cham people in high-ranking positions next to Ibam Manuel to restrain his pro-Vietnamese decision. After these incidents, Ibam Manuel continued to negotiate with the South Vietnamese government. Throughout the next year, Ibam Manuel would work on trying to get the South Vietnamese government to listen to them, all the while also trying to resist the communist aggression in his people's villages. In 1967, the Prime Minister of South Vietnam, Nguyen Cao Ky, tried to pursue a policy of hearing out the Montagnards as well as other previously oppressed religious groups. It finally seemed like progress was being made, and with the Tet Offensive in early 1968, both sides saw massive communist military moves being made against them in major cities and towns across the country, including Kon Tum and Pleiku, against Montagnard outposts as well as Vietnamese ones. This helped push them towards wanting to come up with some kind of mutual agreement quicker so that they could focus on their mutual communist adversary. On December 11, 1968, the summit negotiations between FULRO and the Republic of Vietnam government reached the following agreements. The FULRO movement is entitled to have a flag, not the national flag. The ethnic ministry was immediately established and led by a Montagnard. A Montagnard governor or deputy governor will be nominated in the provinces with a large Montagnard population. The local Montagnard military forces would be placed under the command of Montagnard officers. The signing ceremony would be held in Buôn Ma Thuột in early 1969. And finally, the Ibn Manuel delegation would return from Cambodia to Vietnam immediately. On December 30th, 1968, before the Army of the Republic of Vietnam sent helicopters to Camp Le Roland to pick up Ibn Manuel and the FULRO forces to return to Buôn Ma Thuột, Les Qasim brought the Royal Cambodian Army to surround Camp Le Roland. They captured Ibn Manuel and brought him back to Phnom Penh to be held under house arrest. Most of the other FULRO members were not aware of what happened to him. His capture had been carried out in secret, and many assumed he either fled into the jungle to continue to secretly lead FULRO, or believed he had simply run away for fear of his life. Even all the way up until 1992, there were groups of FULRO cells still awaiting orders from Ibn Manuel. They were completely oblivious to his secret arrest. Years later, in 1975, when the Khmer Rouge took over the capital of Cambodia, they found Ibn Manuel and executed him. On February 1st, 1969, the final agreement was signed between Mr. Paul Nur, representative of the Republic of Vietnam, and Y De Adrong, instead of Ibn Manuel. From this time on, FULRO would generally be more focused on expelling communists from their land, but still faced off against the South Vietnamese from time to time in small, isolated skirmishes in the jungle. In addition to this, there were many instances of betrayal and backstabbing, which continued to make it difficult for the FULRO members to get along with the South Vietnamese military, who they were trying to use as allies. Seemingly, one of the preferred ways the Vietnamese used to eliminate political enemies in the Montagnard villages was to have a bottle of poisoned wine sent by attractive Vietnamese ladies to assassination targets. In March 1970, the Cambodian king, Norodom Sihanouk, was replaced by a right-wing coup while he was on holiday. The people were tired of the king not taking enough action against the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers that were violating Cambodia's sovereignty. After overthrowing the leftist king of Cambodia, the new Cambodian leader, known as Lon Nol, despite being anti-communist and ostensibly in the pro-American camp, backed FULRO against both the anti-communist South Vietnamese and the communist North Vietnamese and Viet Cong. Lon Nol backed FULRO Hill tribes fighting a proxy war against the National Liberation Front via Khmer Krom detachments in South Vietnam and Cambodia's frontier region. During the years 1970 to 1975, the military faction of FULRO focused most of their efforts on fighting the VC and invading North Vietnamese army. During the final military campaign launched by the North Vietnamese, there were numerous times from February to April where FULRO soldiers saw South Vietnamese soldiers in a desperate retreat, throwing down their weapons to run faster to get away from the advancing and overwhelming enemy. In many instances, FULRO guerrillas picked up their dropped weapons and scavenged for any ammo they could find to help them continue their guerrilla war. By the 1970s, the South Vietnamese, for the most part, had a working relationship with the Montagnards. They viewed them as useful allies against the communists. This slow-to-develop relationship would unfortunately come back to bite them when the North Vietnamese took advantage of their trust in one of the final major battles of the war. During the Battle of Buôn Ma Thuột in March 1975, there was some confusion at one point in the battle when some tanks were spotted with a FULRO flag flying on top of them. The South Vietnamese military believed the tanks to be allies who had captured the enemy tanks and mistakenly let some of them drive too close to their lines, only to be met by a deadly close-range attack. This devastated part of the ARVN forces in that area, and at that point, the ARVN believed their FULRO allies in the region betrayed them. But in reality, this had been a trick by the communists to deceive the South Vietnamese forces, and it had worked. During the chaos of this final campaign of the war, FULRO units took advantage of the moment to occupy many outposts along the border and a number of villages in Kon Tum, Pleiku, Dak Lak, Quang Duc, Lam Dong, and Ninh Tuan during the retreats of the Southerners. In Phan Rang, around mid-April 1975, the FULRO Cham force, with about 2,000 gunmen, established village protection guerrilla teams, which flew FULRO flags everywhere in that area. This brief recontrol of their ancestral lands was some of the most success the Chams would achieve during their insurgency. When the People's Army of Vietnam entered, the FULRO Cham guerrillas opened fire against them. Unfortunate for them, they were quickly defeated. Some were killed, some were captured, and others fled to the Dillon Plateau to join up with the FULRO Highland groups to continue organizing the fight. After the fall of Saigon, thousands of FULRO troops led by Y Ngoc Nghe Krieng continued to wage guerrilla warfare against the new communist Vietnamese government, but American promises of aid to them never materialized. FULRO members, as well as some of the conquered Vietnamese military and civilians, would hold on to hope that the Americans would come back one day, but it seemed America wanted to leave Vietnam in their past and move on from it. Once the communists took control of all of Vietnam, they soon began sending ARVN soldiers and civilians to re-education camps and experimental communist new economic zones, as well as co-op farms. Most of the former South Vietnamese military had ceased combat after the order to surrender came over the radio, but the war was far from over for the FULRO guerrilla soldiers. From this point, the communist Vietnamese would double their efforts trying to suppress the FULRO rebels. In May, they started going to various churches in the highlands, and when they saw groups of Montagnards in those churches, they would often accuse them of plotting FULRO activity against the new government. In some cases, they were treated worse than the conquered South Vietnamese, which they now ruled over. The reason being was because they were viewed not only as the enemy, but also as an inferior race to the Vietnamese. They implemented strict curfews for the Montagnards and forbid them from holding tribunal meetings or church services. They tried their best to intimidate the people into giving up information about FULRO. This only drove more people to their cause. Even a few enraged South Vietnamese veterans who wanted to continue fighting against the communists helped fill their ranks in some rare cases. In June 1975, a little over a month after the war had officially ended, the Vietnamese government launched a large-scale campaign to sweep FULRO throughout the Central Highlands. With fresh tanks and heavy artillery support, they attacked FULRO's strongholds in Dak Lak, Lam Dong, and Tien Duc. They recaptured districts and villages under FULRO control. Many high-ranking FULRO Highland cadres were arrested one after another. After they were captured, they were imprisoned in re-education camps as well as work-labor camps, mostly in Bun Mae Thuot and Lam Dong. More than 2,000 FULRO remnants fled to Cambodia for refuge and were now accepted as loose allies by the Khmer Rouge. Though ideologically the Khmer Rouge and FULRO were not aligned, they viewed each other as an alliance of convenience. They both hated the Vietnamese communists and were willing to put aside their differences to work together to fight against them. They were assisted and equipped to advance through Vietnam to capture border villages in Lam Dong, Song Bay, and Dak Lak. Battles in border areas and along the National Highway in 1975 and 1976 were fierce. These would continue well into 1977. For now, I will end this video, as it's already getting quite long. In the next part, we will discuss what happened to FULRO between 1977 until the moment they finally would surrender in 1992. The story of FULRO's efforts to continue to fight well after they nearly lost everything and after so many others gave up is an interesting topic I would like to see more people discuss. The reason I wanted to make this video is because I was really struggling to find any content on YouTube discussing this group and their role they played during the Vietnam War. Many FULRO vets don't want to talk about their experiences. A big reason being fear of retaliation from the communists today, which is still a real threat they have to contend with. And due to this, and other factors, it is sometimes difficult to get as much information as I wanted to. But nonetheless, I hope you learned something new about the 2nd Guerrilla Army of the Vietnam War.